29. The 4 Canadians and their prisoners had trudged across the bleak, windswept plateau for the rest of the day and into the evening. It wasn't until several hours after dark that Eric called a halt, and Will and Evan sank gratefully to the rocky ground. The ache in Will's head had reached somewhat throughout the day, but it still throbbed dully in the background. The dried blood on the wound where the jagged rock had hit him itched abominably, but he knew that if he scratched at the irritation, he would only open the wound and set the blood flowing once more. At last, though, Eric hadn't kept them tied or restrained in any way. As the Canadian leader put it, there was nowhere for the 2 prisoners to run. This plateau is full of wargals, he told them roughly. You can take your chances with them if you choose. So they kept their positions in the middle of the party, passing bands of wargals throughout the day and heading constantly to the northeast and 3 stepped past. Now the 4 Canadians eased their heavy packs to the ground, and Norled began to gather wood for a fire. Svengle tossed a large copper pot at Evelyn's feet and gestured towards a stream that bubbled through the rocks close by. Get some water, he told her gruffly. For a moment the girl hesitated, then she shrugged, took up the pot and rose groaning softly as her tired muscles and joints were called upon once more to take her weight. Come on then, Will said. She said casually. You can give me a hand. Eric was rummaging in his open pack. His head snapped round as she spoke. No, he said sharply, and the entire group turned to look at him. He pointed one blunt forefinger at Evelyn. You, I don't mind wandering off, he said, because I know you'll come back. But as for the ranger, he might just take it into his head to make a run for it in spite of things. Will, who had been thinking of doing just that, tried to look surprised. I'm no ranger, he said. I'm just an apprentice. Eric gave a short snort of laughter. You may say so, he replied, but you dropped them wargals at the bridge as well as any ranger might. You stay where I can keep an eye on you. Will shrugged, smiled wanly at Evelyn, and sat down again, sighing as he leaned his back against a rock. In a few moments he knew it would become hard and knobbly and uncomfortable, but right now it was bliss. The Canadians went ahead making camp. In short order, they had a good fire going, and when Evelyn returned with the pot full of water, Eric and Svengle produced dried provisions, which they added to the water as it heated to make a stew. The meal was plain and fairly tasteless, but it was hot, and it filled their bellies. Will thought ruefully for a few minutes of the prepared food that came from Master Chubb's kitchen. Sadly, he realized that such thoughts of Master Chubb's kitchen and its times in the forest with Holt were no more than memories now. Images sprang into his mind, unbidden, of Tug and Gillen and Horace, of course Redmont seen in the last rays of the setting sun, with its ironstone oars glowing dull red, seeming to hold an inner light. Tears formed behind his eyes, stinging and aching for release. Surreptitiously, he tried to wipe them away with the back of his hand. The meal was suddenly even more tasteless than before. Evelyn seemed to sense his deepening sadness. He felt her warm small hand cover his and knew she was looking at him, but he couldn't meet those vivid green eyes with his own, feeling the tears welling up in them. It'll be all right, she whispered. He tried to talk, but couldn't form the words. Silently, he shook his head, his eyes downcast, staring intently at the scattered surface of the wooden bowl the Canadians had given him to use. They were camped some meters from the side of the road at the top of a slight rise. Eric had stated that he liked to see anyone who might choose to approach. Now, rounding a bend in the road several hundred meters away, came a large group of horsemen, followed by a troop of wargals running to keep up with the horses' trot. The sound of the wargals chant came to them from the breeze once more, and Will felt the hairs on the back of his neck rising. Eric turned swiftly to the two of them, gesturing them back into the cover of the rocks behind their campsite. Quick, you two, behind them rocks if you value your lives. That's Morgoth himself on that white horse. Norlid, Horik, move into the light to screen them. Will and Evelyn needed no second bidding. Staying low, they scrambled into the cover provided by the rocks as Eric had commanded. Two of the Scandinavians stood and moved into the glare of the firelight, drawing the attention of the approaching riders away from the two small figures in the half-light. The chant might mingled with the clatter of hooves and the chink of harness and weapons came closer as Will lay on his stomach, one arm covering Evelyn in the darkness as he had done before. He scooped the hood of his cloak over his head to leave his face in deep shadows. There was a tiny gap between two of the rocks, and knowing he was taking a terrible risk, but unable to resist, he pressed his eyes to it. The view was restricted to a few meters of space. Eric stood on the far side of the fire, facing the approaching riders. Will realized that by doing so, he had placed the glare of the firelight between the new arrivals and the spot where he and Evelyn lay hidden. If any of the wargers looked in their direction, they would be staring straight into the bright firelight. It was a lesson in tactics he filed away for future reference. The sounds of horses and men stopped. The wargles came dead. Chant died abruptly. For a second or two there was a silence. Then a voice spoke, a low voice with a slight snake-like semblance to it. "Captain Eric, where are you bound?" Bill glued his eyes to the crack in the rocks, straining to see the speaker. Without a doubt, that cold, malevolent voice had to belong to Morgoth. The sound of it was the sound of ice and hatred. The sound of nails scraping on the tile. The blood ran cold to hear it. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and beneath his hand he felt Evelyn shiver. If it had a similar effect to Eric, however, he showed no sign of it. My correct title is Jarl, Lord Morgoth, he said, evenly, not Captain. Well then, replied the cold voice, I must try to remember that, in case it is ever the slightest interest to me now. Captain, he said, laying stress on the title this time. I repeat, where are you bound? There was a jingle of harness and crack in the rocks. Will saw a white horse move forward, not a glossy-coated, shining white horse such as a gallant knight might ride, but a pale horse without sheen or life to its coat. It was huge, dead, white, and with wild, rolling eyes. He craned slightly to one side and managed to make out a black gloved hand holding the reins loosely. He could see no more of the rider. We thought we'd join your forces at 3-Step Pass, my lord, Eric was saying. I assume you would still go ahead with your attack, even though the bridge is down. Oh my, it was all just blurry, isn't that great? Morgoth swore horribly at the mention of the bridge. Sensing his fury, the white horse sidestepped a few paces, and now Will could see the rider. Immensely tall but thin, he was dressed all in black. He stooped in the saddle to talk down to the Scandinavians and the hunched shoulders, and his black coat gave him the look of a vulture. The face was thin, with the beak of a nose and high cheekbones. The skin on the face was white and pallid, like the horse. The hairs above it was long, set to frame a receding hairline, and white blonde in color. By contrast, the eyes were black pools. He was clean-shaven, and his mouth was a thin red slit in the palate of his face. As Will looked, the Lord of Rain and Night seemed to sense his presence. He looked up, casting his gaze beyond Eric and his 3 companions, searching into the darkness behind them. Will froze, barely daring to breathe, as those black eyes searched the night. But the lights of the fire defeated Morgoth, and he returned his gaze on Eric. Yes, he replied, the attack will go ahead. Now that Duncan has his own forces deployed and in what he thinks is a strong defensive position, he'll allow us to come out onto the plains before attacking. At which point Horth will take him in the rear, Eric put in with a chuckle, and Morga stared at him, head slightly to one side as he considered him. Again, the bird-like pose made Will think of a vulture. Exactly, he agreed. It would be preferable if there were two flanking forces as I'd planned originally, but one should be enough. My thoughts too, my lord, Eric agreed, and there was a long moment of silence. Obviously, Morgoth had no interest in whether Eric agreed with him or not. Things would be easier if your other countrymen had not abandoned us, Morgoth said eventually. I've been told that your compatriot Ovalk has sailed back to Scandia with his men. I had planned that they should come up the southern cliffs to reinforce us. Eric shrugged, refusing to take blame for something outside his sphere of influence. Ovalk is a mercenary, he said. You can't trust mercenaries. They fight only for profit, and you don't? The toneless voice said with scorn. Eric squared his shoulders. I'll honor any undertaking I made, he said stiffly. Morgoth stared at him again for a long, silent moment. This Canadian met his gaze, and finally it was Morgoth who looked away. Cherith told me you took a prisoner at the bridge, a mighty warrior, he said. I don't see him. Again Morgoth tried to look through the light into the further gloom. Eric laughed harshly. If Cherith was the leader of your Wargles, neither did he replied sarcastically. He spent most of his time at the bridge cowering behind a rock and dodging arrows. And the prisoner? Morgoth asked. Dead, Eric replied. We killed him and threw him over the edge. A fact that displeased me immensely, Morgoth said, and Will felt his flesh crawling. I would have preferred to make him suffer for interfering in my plans. You should have brought him to me alive. Well, we would have preferred it if he hadn't been whipping arrows around at our ears. He could shoot, that's for sure. The only way to take him was to kill him. Another silence, and Will considered the reply. Apparently it was not satisfactory to him. Be warned for the future. I did not approve of your actions. This time it was Eric who let the silence stretch. He shrugged his shoulders slightly as if Morgoth's displeasure was a matter of absolutely no interest to him. Eventually the Lord of Rain and Night gathered his reins and shook them, heeling his horse savagely to turn it away from the campfire. I'll see you at 3 Step Pass, Captain, he said. Then, almost as an afterthought, he turned his horse's back. And, Captain, don't get any ideas about deserting. You'll fight with us to the end. Eric nodded. I told you, my lord, I'll honor any bargains I made. This time Morgoth smiled, a thin movement of the red lips in the lifeless white face. Be sure of it, Captain, he said softly. Then he shook the reins and his horse turned away, spurring a gallop. The Wargers followed the chant starting up again and ringing through the night. Will realized that behind the rocks he had been holding a giant breath. He let it go now and heard a corresponding sigh of relief from the Canadians. My God of battles, said Eric. He doesn't have. Give me the creeps, that one. Looks like he's already died and gone to hell, put in Svengel, and the others nodded. Eric walked round the fire and now stood over where Will and Evelyn were still crouched behind the rocks. You heard that, he said, and Will nodded. Evelyn remained crouching face down behind the rock. Eric stirred her with the toe of his boot. And you, Missy, he said, you heard too. Now she looked up, tears of terror staining tracks in the dust on the face. Wordlessly she nodded. Eric glanced away, in the direction where Morgoth and his wargers had gone. Then remember it if you plan to escape, he said. That's all that awaits you if you get away from us. Okay, well, thank you for listening to me read chapter 29. If you'd like to listen to me read chapter 30, then please stay tuned. Thank you. Bye-bye.